Trevor, good to see you again.
You as well, Luke. It's been a couple weeks.
It has been. We took a week off in order to allow ourselves the opportunity to get to the successful end of our respective semesters and
finish our grading.
My grading's done. How about yours?
It is, indeed. Grades are submitted.
I have to submit my grades later this afternoon or tomorrow, but on Canvas, on our course management program, the students know effectively where they're going to stand for the semester.
Now the real work begins, right?
That's right. Now I have a summer of my own work to do. What about you?
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, a few things in the docket.
And one of the things in our docket, obviously, is going to be continuing and completing this reading of Camus' novel, The Plague. And I think you and I have tentative plans to maybe do at least one more book after a short break, but no set details yet, but we're going to try to think about something to do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Let's talk quickly then about this part 3, which I'd mentioned to you before we recorded was quite curious to me because we don't get the kind of narration that we've been getting thus far in the novel. There are oblique references to most of the major plot development. We see very little or no actual line-by-line dialogue between major characters. I think only Ryu was mentioned. None of our other major characters are mentioned or really make a sighting. And yet it seems that this part is perhaps one of the most important of the entire novel, that there is a lot of development going on here, and the narrator is not necessarily cavalier making light of it, but not giving us really as much as you think we would have gotten.
There's something of a high point or a climax here. I mean, the part opens by saying as much that it's the high point of the summer and something of the climax of the plague in terms of deaths and the severe events that are recounted suggest as much, that there's something both climactic and I think really this is one of the darkest points of the novel so far. I mean, the things that are discussed here in terms of the spreading of the plague, the kind of social chaos, the activity of many of the Oranians, the invocation of martial law, the expediency with which funerals are undertaken, and so on. But like you say, there's not a lot of accounting of or discussion between the particular characters that we've started to get to know, Theroux, Rieux, Rambert, and others. And so this is sort of the face of the city. This is the Oranians as a mob almost. They're the de-individuated Oranians who are under what is referred to at one point the despotic rule of the plague. And maybe that's part of why this section is recounted in the form or in the style, as you suggest that it is.
That's interesting. And I think I'm mostly in agreement with you. One of the things that lingers in the back of my mind, however, is in the previous episodes, you and I have discussed how the plague seems to be making a community out of Oran where none existed, or the plague was making a more complete community out of this collection of individuals. It seems like in this part, that either has not yet happened or the potential of becoming a real community is not there. I'm wondering if you can then maybe recap briefly in broad strokes what was going on in the first two parts to get us to this point, or if not, maybe begin to posit what you think is going on, because it does not seem like Oran is becoming a community in any meaningful sense.
I think it's always been an open question, and this is one of the questions that we have been asking and engaging with in many ways. To what extent is there a community here? What would constitute a proper community? How would one be formed? Is it in the face of crisis that community is either consolidated, or is it in the face of crisis that community collapses? So it's not self-evident that there's been a singular trajectory of community formation. And in a way, you see here, as I said, some kind of de-individuation in the midst of collective calamity. And it happens largely through, I think, the collapse, two things that are signaled in this part, the collapse of certain honors and rites and rituals, the honoring, the confusion of honors that happens with respect to the prison guards and their activity, and we can talk a little bit more about that, and of course, more specifically, the dishonoring of the dead, the expediency with which the funerals are undertaken to the point of cremation, and even the possibility that's proposed that maybe these bodies are piling up so much that not only do we not have time for for proper rites of burial and treatment of the dead and the vigils with the dying and the family coming for funerals. But we might simply have to dispose of these bodies in the sea, for goodness sakes. I mean, there is fortunately they evade that possibility, that alternative. But there's a lot that's happening here with respect to some of the forms and formalities that hold society together and that allow for people to distinguish what is higher and lower, what is honorable and dishonorable in a public sense. All of that is collapsing, and in the midst of all of this, there is great confusion and chaos and legal disorder. I mean, there's just that, in fact, a dishonoring of the law, a lack of honor for the law itself, to the extent that even when martial law is proposed, capital punishment is meted out to those who have transgressed the law. People aren't afraid of this because there's simply so much death around that they have lost respect for the law and even fear of its punishment because they're under some kind of despotism of fear, maybe.
To the extent that plague has become the despotic ruler, seems to me, I think, to be the extent to which Iran has become a community. You were right, I think, that it was an open question this whole time, and it seems like that option is becoming foreclosed. I mean, maybe after the plague, there'll be this opportunity for renewal. We have talked about that in previous episodes, that they'll have an opportunity to, the Iranians will have that opportunity to come back, reassess where they were, and begin the city again. But right now, it seems like they're in the midst of absolute terror. You describe the capital punishment no longer having any effect. I mean, we'll talk about this again, I think, in a few minutes, but one of the most arresting passages for me is that some of the Iranians think that burning their homes, will cure them of plague. And in the midst of that, there are looters who will run into the homes to steal things. And even though the police are there shooting at them, it hasn't stopped them, which means, just as you said, death itself isn't even a deterrent anymore. People are willing to jump into a burning house while being shot at in order to grab who knows what, milk, a television. They didn't have iPads then, but they're going in for something. And I think it's because they know that tomorrow they could be dead anyway. And so there's no sense of justice anymore because people don't really care anymore. The homily of Father Panaloo seems not to have had any effect. And whether that's because Father Panaloo's rhetoric was not what it was meant to be, or whether that's because the plague has proven to be a much more formidable terror than anybody had thought of beforehand, I think is also an open question. But it's clear that this stripping away of morality, of norms, of respects, all of this has been completely eradicated. It's almost like a forest fire that's just tearing down thousands upon thousands of acres, and it doesn't seem like there's any way to stop it. But I think for me, what stands out is the way in which all of that is treated, as I said before, not half-heartedly or lightly, but obliquely. It's indirect. There's small reference to it. There's a quick glossing over it. This whole part that we're reading is one of the shortest that we've covered. There are no subsections of any kind. The narrator clearly wants to get through describing this part as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And obviously, I think it has something to do with the fact of how much gruesomeness is really being discussed and happening. And part of it, I think, is maybe pedagogical from the point of view of either Camus or the narrator. I was thinking of some passages in Thucydides. We had mentioned him before because he has one of the most famous passages of plague literature that's out there. But Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is not about plague per se. It's actually about war between Athens and Sparta. And some of the passages of the war fighting are some of the most obliquely written by Thucydides. And a lot of scholars think that that is his way of signaling to the readers that what was really happening was quite gruesome and gory, and it would be disrespectful or imprudent for him to talk about that in great detail, or maybe even too painful for him to talk about that in detail because he himself was a general and saw much of that. And it's Thucydides' way of letting us know that if you've been to war, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't been, I can never explain it to you. So I'm just going to talk about this very quickly and let you know that this was a pretty big deal, and you have to fill in the rest. I think that might be what the narrator is doing. He knows that for those who lived through plague or who understand it, know that we're hitting the point at which the stuff is beginning to hit the fan really bad, and he doesn't need to dwell on it, and he's signaling to us that it might look like it's not as bad, but the fact that I'm talking about it very briefly is my way of telling you that we're basically at the worst possible point. He already told us it's the climax, it's the high point. That signals to us, I think, as readers, that it's about to get better. But right now, in the climax, it's actually the worst it's ever going to get.
Yeah, well, I think there's something to that. And I mean, if we do look to the text directly, Camus writes that the plague had swallowed up everything and everyone. Right? Striking words. No longer, he goes on, he says, no longer were there individual destinies, only a collective destiny. So this suggests, right, that there's something of a situation where there's a kind of amorphousness to this section. As I said before, this de-individuation or the loss of the individuals and this kind of collective moral corruption, as you were hinting at. How really to describe this, and to what extent can one or ought one dwell on it in the gruesome details? But there's an important point that emerges out of all of this that I think is framed by the question that this part opens on and closes on. It is namely the question of whether individuals do still have a choice, whether there is possibility for moral freedom in the face of what appears to be a force, some sort of abstract, unknown, despotic, what else to call it other than a force, and in this case a disease, or maybe even something tyrannical. Do individuals still have the opportunity to make choices themselves as to how to respond? Is there still room for what one might want to call conscience? In fact, conscience emerges in this, or there's discussion of conscience, a few references to it in this part. And so Camus, I think, is raising the question of whether or not, you have almost on the one hand individuals who might part from the mob and embark down some conscience-driven or reflectively decided course of action, or on the other hand, to acquiesce, descend into what is this sort of amorphous amoralism or immoralism. But let's turn maybe to discuss it at greater length. The two instances of dishonor are questions, are the two instances that seem to raise questions about honor. The first of which has to do with the meting out of medals, and then maybe we'll turn to discuss the funeral. So let me ask you, what is your take on this situation here, this situation about the confusion of medals? What questions did this raise for you from perhaps a strategic standpoint, thinking of the role of the military, the role of the prefect, and deciding about the meting out of things like medals?
I think the use of despotic rule is the most apt. It's the one that is used the most, or at least with the most effect. Right before this discussion about medals in the prison, the narrator says, quote, "The plague was no respecter of persons, and under its despotic rule everyone, from the warden down to the humblest delinquent, was under sentence, and perhaps for the first time impartial justice reigned in the prison." Close quote. That little short passage tells us a couple of things. No surprise, justice inside the prison was not impartial beforehand, despite whatever pretensions everybody thought or wanted to think that it had. We had heard mention of this a little bit, I think, with the original exchange between Rambar and Ryu. Rambar being out here for a story and wanting to know what the conditions were like, about various other things, not specifically the prisons, but there was already kind of an illusion that way out here on this outpost of the French Empire, things are not as just and impartial as the French government perhaps would like to think or pretend that it was. But more importantly, in the prison, much like with any institution, rank and hierarchy have a lot of meaning. There's a lot that goes in with that, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. And it's clear that the fact that the plague is impartial in that respect begins to kind of strip away that sense of hierarchy, which it's a kind of like the informal glue that holds the internal norms of that prison together. But immediately after that passage I just quoted is a new paragraph that begins to describe the attempts that the local authorities made to redress this. And there was an idea, the narrator tells us, to confer military awards on prison guards who may have died under their posts. The military objected. There was some back and forth. The civil authority conceded that, you know what, the military is probably right in their objections. So then they make a different medal that they call the plague medal. And I couldn't help but laugh at the strategy behind all of this, because what that tells us, if you think through, again, the oblique references that are being made, it tells you that there was a problem of morale in the prison and probably elsewhere in the city. Maybe there were riots in the prison because, surprise, I bet the prison population of plague was pretty high. We already get mention of guards being under threat as well. So clearly there's a problem going on in the prison, and the officials, whoever they might be, decided to put a Band-Aid over what's actually a very big problem. And they decided to do it in a roundabout way by boosting morale. I can imagine the warden or maybe the city prefect or somebody thinking, I know what we'll do. We'll give them a military medal, even though they're not members of the military. But there's a kind of logic that I think is being overlooked, in that there's a huge problem and they decided to solve it in a fake way. They weren't thinking about the root problem. They were just thinking about the consequence of, well, everyone's feeling kind of bummed out about the problem. They don't turn around and say, okay, how do we solve the real problem going on here? In other words, these are half measures at best.
It is particularly interesting how they really ultimately botch everything by first allotting this military medal, then coming up with what they call a new honor, a plague medal, as they refer to it. And then really nobody's satisfied because those who get the plague medal saw their fellows previously received the military medal. They have the lesser honor. And all of this really, I mean, it struck me as a remarkable way to describe what the military initially says is going to happen. Their argument, as is written by the narrator, that there's going to be a regrettable confusion in the public mind. And this is a confusion of no small detail. Getting honors right in a society is extremely important. And that's no less true for democratic societies that aspire to greater equality, because honor is a representation of and an affirmation of what is held high by a society, right? What's held to be good and noble. And so blurring this in the way that, there is this regrettable confusion in the public mind is indeed regrettable, because the public's confused about what is, in fact, high and honorable, right? And they risk potentially not holding anything in esteem or anything high. There maybe there's nothing that's publicly honorable. And so you have this retreat into simple individual needs, private interests, and nobody honoring anything at all, maybe giving up on the very ideas of public honor. And so any given community, I think, can honor different things, truly better or worse things, but to then not honor anything at all makes for really a dishonorable society, and maybe not even a society in the proper sense of the word. Maybe this is a dis-society, right? A disassociation when individuals do not commonly honor things publicly. What is there to hold them together that is above and beyond them? What is higher?
Something you said provoked a thought about why this might be difficult to understand for some readers, because at least in our day and age, there's a generic sense that we've moved past honor, that we are an egalitarian society, that honor is something for old societies and we've moved beyond that. I'm suspect of that. I actually don't think that is the case, because we've moved the locus of honor from things like military service or to whether or not you have the more prestigious job at Google as a coder, or you are the superstar athlete, but it actually still plays a much more prominent role. And yet I think for a lot of people, even if they are concerned with honor themselves, even if they bestow honors on other people, they themselves might think that they've moved beyond honor.
Every society is constantly competing over honors, as the individuals within societies are competing over honors, whether they realize it or not. I mean, offices are like a kind of honor. Titles are a form of honor. So these kind of formalities, forms, honors, and offices are inevitably a part of democracy, as much as we like to pretend that they're not.
Right. Just the other day, I was on Twitter and there was a little mini back and forth fury that I saw. There was a journalist who objected to PhDs using the term doctor, because we should only trust medical doctors because they're the ones with the expertise. And it was interesting to follow. because social scientists, economists, medical researchers, all of whom have PhDs, pointed out that there's actually quite a different relationship, that it's actually PhDs that are doing the knowledge production, because we're at the forefront of building knowledge, or at least discovering knowledge, inventing knowledge if they're an engineer.
Well, it's maybe a competition among those honored with a title over who is most honorable.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not incidental that there's this kind of confusion that sets in, and afterwards the narrator then describes how there's a general feeling of unrest, and there's relative isolation, and there's even a wave of revolutionary violence, right? I think there's a connection between this confusion or mishonoring, this confusion about honor or mishonoring, that then leads to a dishonoring of the law or lack of honor and respect for the law. And then this, if this is indeed a chain of reasoning on Camus' part, it culminates in the dishonoring of the dead, and what we see with the funerals and the burial rites in this regard. Yeah, and so this, I mean, in the discussion that emerges follows upon a remark by the narrator that Oran seemed a huge necropolis, right? I mean, this is a city of the dead, and what follows is a discussion here about just how disrespectful the city starts to treat the dead. I mean, there's something very important in, I think, human civilization to how we treat the dead, and that we don't just look upon them as corpses, whether from the perspective, from a faith perspective, religious perspective, or otherwise. I mean, even in a secular, so-called post-Christian society, we still seek to honor the dead with certain forms and rituals and rites and practices, and yet in the midst of a plague, there's a necessity for expediency so as to not bring about more death, so as to mitigate the spread of the plague. But this is not something that settles easily with the people of Iran. And in fact, the prefect at one point, as things are slowly progressing, says that he's aware of a kind of indignity that they're engaging in.
I've already talked about Thucydides at some length. Let me mention another ancient Greek reference, the play by Sophocles, Antigone, which centers around this problem of respecting the dead. I'll spare the listeners the full details to keep us kind of on track, but the whole fulcrum of that play is about a sister who wants to bury her brother and give him the proper burial rites over and against orders of the king not to do so. Why is burying the dead important? I mean, I think it speaks to the human condition, especially for most of us in the world who do believe in some form of the afterlife. And even for those of us who do not, there's something about recognizing the finitude of our experience here on earth, as well as thinking about the broader moral implications of, again, free will. If we have free will, the choices we made during this life have real moral value. If we don't have free will, then there's no justice, then it doesn't matter. And it's at burial that we often have the opportunity to reflect upon a particular person's life's choices. I think you're right to point out that this is a huge problem in Iran, that they're not given those opportunities. The grievers, we learn, are not even permitted toward the end of this passage to be at the actual internment. And even that was not authorized officially, which means it was a minor concession that the government had to make, but probably they had an initial policy of you couldn't even be there. And there's a huge stripping away. The narrator in the second paragraph after you mentioned that Iran seemed like a huge necropolis, that's a quote from the text. I think it's the next paragraph after that or thereabout. The narrator reminds us that there was a darkness in men's hearts. And when we think about necropolis, we don't think of it as being a brightly lit city. We probably think of a necropolis as being dimly lit. The narrator describes it as by moonlight. We're back in Plato's cave somewhere. There's a lot going on here that obviously the narrator wants us to know.
And a necropolis is another word for a cemetery.
Indeed, yeah. So this is becoming more than just a policy problem. It really is becoming a social, spiritual, maybe even a theological problem for the city.
No, I think the way that we honor the dead and bury them properly speaks to the fact that, as you suggest, we think the human person is something more than just their bodily existence or something more than just the aggregation or sum of their bodily parts. And then we might have something like what we call the soul. And so the way that we treat the dead, so it says a great deal about how much and in what way or for what reasons we value human life. So again, this is a matter of proper honors, of properly honoring life. And as you say, at funerals, there are speeches given honoring the dead, eulogies, but there is a commemoration, right? Often it's said, we remember together the dead. And that happens in a formal manner at funeral ceremonies. When the state prohibits that process, you have this loss of commemoration and indeed a kind of losing of the memory of the person that has passed. It's interesting that after this discussion of the dishonoring of the dead, insofar as ultimately this culminates in kind of mass burials where they first distinguish between men and women and then ultimately everyone's lumped together. After this whole discussion, there is a telling account by the narrator about the loss of memory of individuals. Individuals are losing their sense and proportion of time. They're losing some sense of the past. They have clearly, by way of the loss of commemorations and funerals, lost any remembrance of those loved ones who have since passed. The memory of their faces fades as a shadow and then passes from them, as the narrator says. There's a great deal that's happening here, which culminates in a complete and utter loss of hope, a dark despondency that sets in that follows from the loss of these social practices and honors regarding the dead.
In fact, I think the passage you're thinking of is the one that I highlighted as well, which reads, quote, "Without memories, without hope, they lived for the moment only. Indeed, the here and now had come to mean everything for them. There was no denying that the plague had gradually killed off in all of us the faculty not of love only, but even of friendship. Naturally enough, since love asks something of the future, and nothing was left of us but a series of present moments," close quote. Early in the first part of this novel, and in the second, there's reference to memory of the past being lost and being stripped away, memories fading. You can't recall your loved one who was on the other side of the town, who maybe had traveled and couldn't get back in. And, there's this monotony that occurs because of your daily life now is pretty much the same. Again, to bring it back to present day, I think many people are familiar with the memes that are going around of, I don't even know what day it is because every day of my stay-at-home lockdown order looks like every other day. What is one of the effects of all that, I think, is what we're seeing here. We first lose our sense of time. We first lose our memory of the past. We then lose our understanding of the future. There was a reference in just a few passages above how there's a sense of despair.
And indeed, the habit of despair is worse than despair itself, which is said here, which seems important.
That's right. And what is despair? Despair is a loss of hope. Again, one more time, these are theological questions that Camus is pointing us to. We should recall that hope is one of the theological virtues.
Let's be clear. Hope is not some kind of optimism, right? Or it's simply a hope for a better future in the sense of a utopia, right? Hope is connected to the good, and again, to something honorable, to something high. So to have hope is to look up, and not just look forward, but to look up in a way that certainly has to do with the future, but is not necessarily a strictly temporal.
That's exactly right. And there's something else that I wanted to add about that, because in classical and medieval theology, despair in conjunction with presumption are the two worst sins possible, because both mean that an individual has lost hope and faith and trust in God. Because if you don't believe or trust in God, that He will carry the day in the end, as Father Panelou had advised the Oranians to do, then you do lose your sense of time, because now that trans-historical justice of coming about isn't there. And when you die, that's it. What we're seeing in Camus here, by describing first that it's despair and then the habits of despair being worse, then telling us that all hope itself has been lost, is yet another theological reference to the types of problems that the Oranians are experiencing.
Yeah, and actually that brings to mind a passage here that speaks to believers, but I have a question as well. The narrator writes here, "That evening hour for which believers is the time to look into their consciences is hardest of all hours on the prisoner or exile who has nothing to look into but the void." And so my question here, I guess, is that I mean, certainly for believers, conscience is an important faculty that is applied to reflect on these various virtues and look upon their own lives each day as to whether they've lived up to these virtues in their various activities, thoughts, and in their hearts. But why is conscience not necessarily something for the non-believer as well? I mean, can a non-believer not still examine their conscience? And doesn't this speak to the importance of still forming and shaping conscience, even in a so-called secular society? I mean, to have either only conscience or the void, it seems like a stark dichotomy and maybe even a false one, because the importance of conscience is such that in the end, when we're stripped of everything else, we still have this faculty. It can't be taken from us unwillingly. And so this speaks to what we were mentioning before about how everyone still has a choice. And wherein do we find this freedom of the will to choose something other than to become what the narrator later refers to the town people as being sleepwalkers, to fall into what you were describing just a moment ago, the state of and continual habit of despair.
I agree that it is a false dichotomy in reality, in the world in which you and I certainly experience and live in. Somebody who is not a believer can still examine their conscience. To examine your conscience means to look back critically at your own choices and take stock of what you did right and what you did wrong, and think through what you might need to do to make amends. Do you really owe someone an apology? You have to do better at your decision making in the workplace or something to that effect. But where it might be a true dichotomy, at least in so far as the narration of the Oranian plague experience in this novel is concerned, is that for the Oranians who don't believe in God or who did not heed Father Panel's sermon with any real gravity, especially for those who additionally now have fallen into the habits of despair, they now lack the habit of examining their conscience. And so it's not an option in the effective truth of where they are, is that they don't have the means or the habits or the wherewithal to examine their conscience. Not that they couldn't, but now that it's not there, now that they're sleepwalking and kind of on a moral autopilot, they only have the void of the plague.
Although I guess we will see in the coming parts how the characters Rieux, Rambert, and Tarrou are perhaps in some sense a reflection of individuals who, whether they had this French Catholic education or not, nonetheless seem to embody some practice of conscience and its examination, because it seems to me that where there is conscience, there is freedom and human dignity, and where there is dignity and freedom, you find conscience, at least in some form, that has been formed and is applied, let's say, in some way. So whether in a religious manner or otherwise, these other characters, unlike the mass of Oranians that are described in this short part, they still do embody some of this remnant, perhaps.
That's a great point to end on, Trevor. I think we can wrap up this short discussion on a short part of this novel where we are. You and I are back on schedule. Our grades are in. We are effectively on the summer workload, which is obviously much reduced now that we're not teaching and grading. And so we will resume our regular weekly schedule until we wrap up this novel. Our listeners, again, are encouraged to like and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Those are very important. It's my understanding that, as you get reviews and as you get likes and thumbs up and all those other ways of rating these things, it tells the algorithm that the current listeners think that this is important, and then they go on to recommend, the algorithms will recommend the podcast to others.
We're looking for high honors.
Indeed we are. Speaking of honors, we are looking for rating and reviewing to help us be discovered by other potential people. Continue sending us feedback on Twitter. I am at Luke M. Perez on Twitter.
T.M. Shelley.
And that's Shelley with an EY, correct?
That is correct. Thank you. Like the poet.
Like the poet. And you can use the hashtag ASU and the hashtag Camus, CAMUS. You don't necessarily have to do it as Camus ASU. You can just use the two hashtags separately. That'll allow other people to find the Camus comments, as well as Trevor and I to find those who are responding specifically to this podcast.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome to Pandemic Dialogues from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This series seeks to sustain the intellectual community we built with students, ASU colleagues, and the wider community while our regular speaker events are postponed. We offer the dialogues in two modes: a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work on pandemics and civic crisis, and this podcast, with extended discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. More on the dialogues and the school is at scetl.asu.edu.
Почтенный председатель,